Okay, now we're going to be talking about power. And this is essentially, with power, it's, you have, one or more individuals that essentially can essentially have a strong amount of influence over other members of the group. So if you have an authority figure, for example, who essentially tells you to do something and you feel you have to do it, then that authority figure has power over you. Okay, and of course there are circumstances where powers are useful. Having power allows us to be able to start getting things done and be able to motivate people to do things. Having the power gives us a lot of ability to do that. But also power, when power gets overboard, when there's too much power, then perhaps power can be abused, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so let's start with talking about obedience to authority. So you have an interaction, and you have a powerful figure essentially giving a demand to someone less powerful, and the less powerful obeys. That's obedience to authority. And Stanley Milgram did classic research on obedience to authority. Basically, he was interested in doing this research because of what happened during World War II, Nazi Germany. In the Holocaust, essentially 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis. And Hitler, started this all, but Hitler did not do all the killing. Basically, he had there were people who obeyed orders and did terrible, terrible things just because they were obeying orders. So Milgram was wondering why some people would do terrible things just because of obeying orders, and he was wondering if he could set up a circumstance where somebody could do something that would be pretty bad, just because they were following orders. See the extent to which people would do this. So he set up a circumstance where he would create a study where participants would take the role of either the teacher or the learner. Okay? And he would tell subjects that it was a study on how to improve learning, perhaps using aversive conditioning to help promote learning. Okay? And the idea would be that the teacher would give instructions to the learner, and the learner would if the learner made a mistake, then the teacher would provide like a mild punishment, and to see if the punishment actually would increase the learning. But in reality, there really was only one subject. The person who was the idea is that the people would be randomly assigned to be either the teacher or the learner. But in reality, the learner was always going to be working for the experimenter, and the teacher was always going to be the subject. So there was deception involved in this particular study, and basically the teacher was assigned to ask the questions and administer mild shocks to the learner, and when the learner got a question wrong. Okay. And the experimenter was giving the instructions standing right next to the teacher, while the learner was put into another room, strapped into a chair, hooked up with electrodes, and meanwhile the teacher had to ask the questions, and they had to flick switches on this like shock machine here. And on the one end here was like very mild shock, then moderate shock, then danger, severe shock, and then finally XXX, all the way across to 450 volts. In reality, no one was actually being shocked. and the learners again was in on the experiment, and he gave scripted responses to each level of shock that the teacher would administer. Okay? And so the learner would be would be protesting hearing in this kind of circumstance, saying, hey, this really hurts, these shocks, because the shocks would increase in intensity. But the experimenter would give prods, and the experimenter would say, the experiment requires you to continue. Some more prods at the experiment. Please continue. Please go on. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. So basically, every time, when the learner makes a protest, get me out of here. I don't want to participate anymore. The teacher, who was the real subject, maybe stops giving says, hey, experimenter, what should I do? He wants to leave. The experimenter would say, experiment requires that you continue, and so on, until the teacher, goes back to what he was doing and giving out, asking the questions and giving the shocks. If you take a look here are the responses that the learner made, the protests at each level of shock. So at 75 volts, at like 120 volts, hey, this really hurts. At 150 volts, now the learner is saying that he wants to quit. Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you, I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out. And it gets progressively worse. 330 volts. Intense and prolonged agonized scream. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Hysterically. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. 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 So anyway. But these are all scripted responses. The learner is not actually being shocked. So basically, the experimenter was wanting to see how far, how long would people go until they finally quit? Because the shock panel went all the way up to 450 volts. Well, what Milgram found was very surprising. Surprising to Milgram and to other professionals who were asked during that time. He thought that only the sadists, only the crazy, the people who loved administering pain would go all the way to the end. But what he found was shocking. He found that over 60% of the subjects went all the way to the end. In fact, all the way up to 315 volts, everybody, all of the subjects obeyed and kept on giving the shocks, even after the learner was saying, let me out of here. So if you take a look here at these results here, out of the basically 12.5% stopped after 300 volts, but 65% went all the way to the end. And this was extremely surprising. So he was very troubled by these findings as far as how far people would go in potentially harming someone. Because then after like 330 volts, the subject didn't even respond anymore. The learner, I should say, didn't even respond anymore. Now, he discovered that by altering the circumstances, so what was it about this circumstance that made it so easy for people to obey and do these terrible things? Well, one important thing was those commands, those prods that the experimenter used, saying, the experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. Without those kind of prods, very few people continued all the way to the end. Almost everybody stopped. So, bottom line is that those prods were key to maintaining obedience. What about gender differences? Were females any kinder than males? No. Females obeyed the authority just as much as males did. Now, what if this study was done in an office building instead of in a university laboratory? Milgram was from Yale University, so it was a prestigious university, therefore it gets a lot of credibility, a lot of respect in the community. Therefore, if you are doing something for Yale University, if you're participating in a university from the subject's point of view, then yeah, you will obey the authority because you respect that authority, you trust that authority. But what if the experiment is just in an office building done for like some corporate purpose? Then there's going to be a lot less obedience, and that's what was shown. What if the person in charge was not a scientist, but rather just an ordinary person? Milgram was a scientist, he's wearing the lab coat, garnering respect, he's going to be obeyed. If it's just an ordinary Joe, then there's going to be a lot less obedience. So that also tells you that the status of the person who is giving the order plays a big role in terms of whether or not someone is going to obey. What if the experimenter is in a remote location, so in another room, talking via intercom? In that case, that increased distance between the experimenter and the teacher makes the teacher less likely to obey kind of like when the cat's away, the mice will play type of thing. So the experimenter was in another room, so there was less obedience there. What if, however, the victim was in the same room as the participant? There was less obedience, but there was still plenty of it. 40% went all the way to the end when the learner was in the same room, so it was screaming and yelling and everything, all in the same room. How about when the participant was required to actually touch the victim, when the participant actually had to when the teacher actually had to push the learner's hands down onto a shock plate? Even then, that 30% went all the way to 450 volts. That is pretty incredible. But take a look at this. When two Confederates rebel, when two Confederates who were presumably participating in this study, when they quit, they said, "I'm not doing this anymore, I'm leaving," then there was a lot less obedience. Now think about this. Do you remember when we talked about conformity, when we talked about Ash's study, and how when everybody was given the wrong answer, the subject felt pressure to give the wrong answer as well. But if even one other Confederate gave a different answer, even if the different answer was still not the right answer, but was different from what everybody else was, basically conformity pretty much disappeared. And that's similar to what's happening here, because conformity and obedience is kind of on it's kind of like on a continuum in terms of, obedience is a little bit stronger than conformity, but it's all kind of in the same area, almost, range of social influence. The bottom line is, seeing two other individuals quit gave people the confidence to quit as well. See? So if two others, refused to give the shots, there was 90% disobedience. But if two others gave the shots, so if two other Confederates just followed along and obeyed the experiment, then there was 92% obedience. That's something even more dramatic. Seeing other people obey the authority makes people more likely to do it. And now think about real life circumstances. If let's say you're in the military and you were to and your commanding officer ordered you to do something that you felt was morally reprehensible. He ordered you and he ordered everybody else in your troop to do that. Well, if you see everybody else in the troop doing what is being ordered, then you're going to be much more likely to follow along, because you're not only obeying the authority, you're also conforming to what everybody else in the group is doing. this is the kind of thing that happened, for example, in the My Lai massacre. So you could look it up, M-Y-L-A-I massacre, that happened during the Vietnam War. You had a commanding officer, I think Lieutenant Calley, who ordered his platoon to essentially destroy a village and kill everyone in it, men, women, and children. And they pretty much did that, and they destroyed that village and, basically killed just about everybody. There were some survivors, but basically people obeyed those orders, and it was one of the horrible moments during the Vietnam War. So this is so people have the so people are capable of doing terrible things, based on obedience to authority. Now, Milgram's research was challenged on methodological grounds. The idea that, well, maybe these subjects, these teachers, really knew what was going on, and they were just kind of playing along, and that it really wasn't, they really weren't, they really didn't know that they really didn't think that they were doing any harm, that it was just a game for them. But no, that's really, the evidence just doesn't fly with that. Basically, the subjects, there have been videos of subjects taking this. The subjects were very nervous and very upset and were really sweating. It was not something that this was not a pleasant experience. They really thought that they were doing it. And interviews following them show that the manipulation was largely effective. Most of the subjects did find the circumstance believable, and so they were acting essentially naturally. And the amazing degree of obedience to authority, which was very surprising. Actually, when you think about it, when you do look at what's happened in military and other circumstances, it's pretty right on. Okay. One of the other things that you should that's been highly criticized is the ethical aspects of this particular subject. Now, not only learners without actually shock, but what about those teachers? What about those subjects who thought that they might have been actually administering life-threatening shocks to another human being? Were there any long-term effects on those individuals? Now, Milgram himself believed that the answer was no, that there were no long-term effects. To his credit, he did debrief each of the subjects, explain what was going on, saying that nobody was hurt. He even had the learner come out, smiling, shaking hands with the teacher, indicating that nobody was hurt. But that we don't really know what kind of long-term effects it could have had on those people who participated in it. Again, Milgram has passed away, so he can't really defend himself now, but it's a very controversial, it was very controversial research. But realize this, how much we learn from it is so important in terms of, I think it's important to know what human beings are capable of under certain circumstances. Just being aware of that allows us to at least step back and be a little bit more careful in terms of the decisions we make. Whether or not we should be blindly obeying authority. I think it's a good thing to be aware of our vulnerability. Because most people would say, oh, I would never do that. I would never shock another person like that. But these were not crazy people. These were not sadists. These were normal, everyday people who did this. Okay? Turns out that there was actually, they've done replications of this, or modified replications of this, to see whether the results, because this study was done way back in the 1950s, or in the 1960s. The question is whether the results, whether things might be different today. Well, let's take a look at this, video. Let's take a look and see what we maybe that there was maybe some differences here.
Hi, I'm Chris Cuomo, and welcome to our Prime Time webcast, a look at one of the most shocking experiments of the last 50 years, literally. Imagine this scenario. You go to a prestigious university to participate in a learning and memory experiment. When you arrive, you discover that the teaching instrument is this machine, which seems to give electroshocks to a man on the other side of the wall. As you move up the scale, he begins to scream out in pain.
The experiment requires that you continue.
The experimenter pressures you to go on. Would you agree to continue? 45 years ago, Dr. Stanley Milgram came up with this experiment to test whether people would blindly follow the orders of an authority figure. He found that 2/3 of his subjects were willing to give the most dangerous shock on the machine. We teamed up with Dr. Jerry Berger, a social psychologist at Santa Clara University in California, to see whether people have changed since then.
Wrong. 90 volts.
The typical response is to turn toward the experimenter and, if not say something, at least give a look that says, what should I do?
In our new experiment, how many people would agree to follow the orders of an authority figure?
Ow. That's incorrect.
39-year-old Troy Shasker is an electrician. He's been paid $50 to participate and told that the money is his to keep even if he quits the experiment early. He's worried about the dangers of the electroshock machine.
Wow. I don't think I should shock him that hard if he really does screw up. That's been a severe shock there.
Yeah, there are 20
Now you just go get my shotgun.
There are 20.
In the room next door, Troy watches as the learner gets strapped into his chair and really gets nervous once he hears him say this.
I should probably bring up, a couple of years ago at Kaiser, they diagnosed a mild heart condition. I'm really not too worried about it. It's not that serious, but
Well, you should know that while the shocks that we'll be using today may be painful, they're not dangerous. Okay?
Milgram intended that scripted exchange to set up a conflict in the subject's mind, a choice between the health of the learner and the authority of the experimenter.
Number 1.
Then the test begins.
Blue. Boy. Girl. Grass. Hat.
The learner must decide which of the 4 words is the correct match. At first, everything goes smoothly.
Correct.
I was confident that he was doing really good at first, and then it started looking bad.
Then, at 75 volts, Troy hears the first sign of trouble.
Soft. Rug. Pillow. Hair. Grass. Incorrect. 75 volts.
I could actually hear him next door going, ow, oh, and he kept getting things wrong.
Incorrect. 90 volts.
At 105 volts, he's clearly uneasy.
I got a little moist on my forehead there. I wasn't comfortable. I can't tell you why I listened to him and kept going. I should have just said no.
The correct word was duck. Rock. House.
At 150 volts,
Incorrect. 150 volts.
will Troy listen as the learner begs him to stop, or will he follow Brian's orders?
Tell the correct word, pair of white. The correct word was white horse.
The next item, please continue.
The next item is sad.
He obeys the orders.
Face.
Why didn't you stop? I saw him getting strapped in, and they were just like little. I mean, he could have just, if he was in that much pain, he could have just tore himself off.
why are you putting it on him and not you or the experimenter?
I was just doing my job. I was doing what I was supposed to do.
75 volts.
So I guess the influence of having the conductor of the experiment right there next to me telling me to keep going had a lot to do with it.
For the past 30 years, there have been severe restrictions on using humans in social psychology research. To avoid putting subjects under too much stress, Dr. Berger made a significant change to our experiment.
In this experiment, you stopped at 150 make-believe volts. In Milgram, they went much higher.
We stopped for ethical reasons. We couldn't put people through the agony that Milgram's participants went through.
I told you I had heart trouble. My heart started to bother me now.
Are there clues that indicate whether certain people might be more compliant with authority?
Wrong. 90 volts.
When you were watching, how good were you at guessing? Oh, this person may go or this may not.
It was impossible to tell. I tried to guess. I tried to look for signs, body language, anything to try to guess who's going to continue, who's going to stop. And that tells me that it's not that there are certain kinds of people who are obviously different from the rest of us. It tells me that probably all of us are capable.
Thanks for watching our primetime webcast, and be sure to watch again next week at abcnews.com. I'm Chris Plummer.
Okay, so as you can see, it wasn't just that in the early 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, people were just more likely to obey authority. People obey authority now too. So it does, this effect is still robust. People will obey authorities, even though, again, the authority is not holding a gun to the guy's head, but people will still obey.